The man didn't knock. Vernon Slade kicked the door open so hard it cracked against the stone wall and the sound rang through the canyon like a gunshot. Eliza was on her knees in the garden when she heard it. She looked up. Slade's hired man was already standing over Caleb, one hand gripping the back of his collar like he was holding a stray dog. Slade himself walked slow, the kind of slow that belongs to men who've never been told no, straight through the bean rows, crushing every plant beneath his boots without looking down. He didn't even look down. He stopped 3 feet from Eliza, looked at the terraces she'd built stone by stone with her own bleeding hands, and said, "Pack your things. This water belongs to us now." If you've ever built something from nothing with your hands, your sweat, your last dollar, and watched someone try to take it, you already know what Eliza felt in that moment. If you haven't, I hope you never do. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because the stories we tell on this channel will reach into your chest and grab something real, and I mean that. Drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button too, because every single one helps us keep going. Now let's go back to where this all began. The summer of 1888 did not forgive anyone. It baked the Arizona territory down to the bone, cracked the earth into plates, and turned dry washes into chalk. The cottonwood trees along what used to be creek beds stood gray, and leafless by July, their roots sucking at nothing. Livestock died standing up. And somewhere east of the Tucson Basin, on a rutted trail that barely deserved to be called a road, a family wagon rolled forward on wheels that squealed with every rotation, pulled by a horse that had already given more than it had left to give. Caleb Rourke sat on the buckboard with the reins loose in his hands. He wasn't guiding the horse so much as going wherever it decided to go. That's how tired he was. That's how far gone things had become. Beside him, Eliza sat with Tobin pressed against her side, the boy's head resting heavy on her arm, mouth open, dead asleep in the punishing afternoon heat. She was fanning him with the brim of her own hat, the hat she'd stopped wearing 3 days ago, because she decided the boy needed the shade more than she did. That was Eliza. She was not a small woman. She had never been small. Her frame was broad and heavy, built for endurance rather than speed, and in the years before Arizona's, she'd heard every unkind word a person could hear about a body like hers. But out here, in this merciless country, nobody said much of anything anymore. They were all too thirsty to talk. 11 days. That's how long they'd been moving. 11 days since they'd left the ruins of what used to be their second farm, the one in New Mexico territory, that the drought had finished off after the hailstorm had started the job. The one before that had been in Texas. Before that, somewhere in Kansas that Caleb didn't like to talk about. 3 farms in 7 years, and since seeing every single one of them had taken something from the Rourkes that they couldn't get back. Money. Time. Belief in themselves. The money was mostly gone now. "How far to the next water?" Eliza asked. Her voice was flat, the way voices get when a person has used up their worry and come out the other side into something quieter and harder. Caleb didn't answer right away. He squinted at the trail ahead. Pike said there was a spring. 12 miles, maybe 15. Pike said a lot of things. Yeah, he didn't argue. Orson Pike was a surveyor they'd met at a trading post 4 days back, a lean, sharp-faced man with ink-stained fingers and opinions he handed out like he was doing you a favor. He'd looked at Caleb's worn boots, at Eliza's condition, at the patched canvas over the wagon bed, and decided the Rourkes were not worth his serious attention. He'd given them the spring directions the same way you throw scraps to a dog, useful enough to get rid of them, not worth worrying about afterward. Eliza had seen the way Pike looked at them. She always noticed. The dark. She'd spent 31 years learning how to read the difference between a man who looked through you and a man who was just tired. Pike was the first kind. The horse stopped. Not because Caleb pulled the reins, it just stopped, the way animals do when they've made a private decision that they're finished. Its head dropped. Its sides heaved. Caleb sat there for a moment, staring at the animal's back. And then he stepped down from the buckboard without a word and walked to the horse's head and stood there with his hand on its jaw, not doing anything, just standing. Eliza watched him. She knew that posture. She'd seen it after the Kansas farm, after the Texas farm, after every time the world had taken a swing at Caleb Rourke and connected. He'd stand very still, like if he didn't move, maybe the thing that was happening wasn't really happening. She climbed down herself, which took effort, always took effort, and walked to his side. "We're not done," she said. He didn't look at her. "Eliza, we're not done, Caleb." He exhaled through his nose, long and slow, and she watched his shoulders come up slightly, not all the way, but enough. Tobin woke up when the wagon stopped, the way children do instantly, completely, with no memory of having been asleep. He stood up in the wagon bed and looked around at the red rock walls rising on either side of the trail and said, "Are we there?" "Not yet," Caleb said. But soon Eliza looked at her husband. Caleb looked at the trail ahead. Soon, he said, they walked the horse. That was the afternoon they found the crack. Not found it. Exactly, Tobin found it. He'd hopped of its windows were dark. He'd hopped off the wagon tail because he was 5 and couldn't sit still when the wagon wasn't moving fast enough to be interesting, and he'd been trailing behind, kicking rocks and examining things the way small boys do when the world is still young enough to be fascinating rather than cruel. He stopped at the base of a towering red sandstone wall that rose maybe 80 feet straight up. He stood there, staring. "Papa." Caleb didn't hear him the first time. "Papa." Something in the second one made Caleb turn. The boy had both arms crossed over his chest, chin tipped up, looking at the rock face with an expression of complete seriousness that belonged on someone 3 times his age. Caleb walked back. Eliza followed. The crack was narrow, barely wider than a man's shoulders at the widest point, and tapering down at the bottom so you'd have to angle your feet to get through. It cut through the sandstone wall from roughly knee height up to maybe 12 feet. A dark vertical gap that swallowed all the light immediately after the first few feet, so you couldn't tell how deep it went. What you could tell, if you stood close enough, was that the air coming out of it was cool. Not the brutal, superheated air of the Arizona afternoon. Cool. The kind of cool that meant water. Caleb stood still for a moment. Then he handed the reins to Eliza without a word, crouched down, turned sideways, and pushed himself into the crack. It was tighter than it looked. The sandstone pressed against his chest and back simultaneously, and he had to exhale to fit. He moved forward in short sideways shuffles, 1 foot at a time, palms flat against the stone on either side. The light dropped away fast. Within 10 feet, he was moving in near total shadow, navigating by feel. Then the walls widened, and the crack opened. He came out of the passage and straightened up slowly, and he stood there for a moment that he would never, for the rest of his life, be able to fully describe. The canyon was not large, maybe 150 feet across at its widest, hemmed in on all sides by walls of deep red sandstone that climbed until they framed a strip of hard blue sky. The floor was stone and packed earth. There was a young cottonwood growing near the far wall, its leaves a green so vivid after 11 days of brown and gray that it looked almost painful. But it was the sound that stopped him. Water, faint, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. He walked toward the far wall and crouched and put his hand against the rock and felt the moisture seeping through. 3 places, 3 separate seeps, dark stains on the sandstone, where water pushed out of the rock and ran down in thin fingers and collected in a shallow pool at the base, before soaking into the soil. He sat down on the canyon floor. He just sat there. After a while, he heard the scraping sound from the passage behind him, and he turned. The crack was going to be harder for Eliza. He knew that before he heard her, he got up and went back to the passage mouth on the inside and called her name. "I'm in it," she called back. Her voice was strained. The passage at its narrowest was maybe 16 inches across. Eliza was a large woman, broader at the hip and shoulder than Caleb by a significant measure, and he could hear from her breathing what the stone was doing to her. The rock doesn't care about your situation. It doesn't move for you. You either fit or you don't. And if you don't fit, you have to decide how badly you want what's on the other side. "Stop for a second," he said. "I'm fine. Just stop. Breathe." A pause. "Caleb, what is it?" The question had an edge in it, not frustration, exactly, but the measured fear of someone who has already pushed past comfort and needs to know the pushing was worth it. "Water," he said. 3 seeps, clean stone. There's a cottonwood. Silence. Then he heard her start moving again. Slower, patient shuffles through the dark. She made a sound once, not a cry, more like a forceful exhale against something that hurt and then nothing else, and then the passage widened on his end, and she came through and straightened up. Her dress dusty, her hair pushed loose from its pins, a red scrape across her forearm from the stone. She looked around. She didn't say anything for a long time. Caleb watched her take in the cottonwood, the seeps, the walls, the strip of sky. He watched her walk to the nearest seep and press her palm flat against the wet stone and close her eyes. "Lord," she whispered. Then she caught herself, opened her eyes, and just stood there with her hand on the rock. "3 of them," Caleb said. "I see. The soil's thin. Rocky. It'd be a lot of work." She looked at him. "When has that stopped us?" He almost smiled, almost. They got Tobin through last, which was easy. The boy was small enough to walk through, standing upright, and he came out of the passage and looked around the canyon with 5-year-old practicality and immediately announced that he was hungry, which broke whatever spell had been settling over the moment and made Eliza laugh, a real laugh, not a polite one, the kind that sounds like relief. They made camp that night inside the canyon walls. Eliza had a tin box she kept in the wagon beneath her good blanket. Inside it were seeds she'd been carrying since before Kansas, really. She'd brought them from her mother's garden in Ohio when she was 19 years old, added to them along the way, traded for what she could get, protected them through heat and cold and 2 failed farms, like they were the most important things she owned, because she'd decided long ago that they were. Beans, squash, lettuce, onions, strawberries. 3 grape cuttings wrapped in damp cloth that had somehow survived the whole journey still living. She didn't open the box that night. She just held it while Caleb built a small fire from the dry wood near the canyon wall, and Tobin fell asleep against her leg before the beans were even warm. And the stars came out above the strip of open sky, sharper and closer from inside the canyon walls than they ever seemed from open ground. "Someone will say we can't make it work," Caleb said. "Someone always does." He looked at the seeps, the cottonwood, the walls holding out the desert like they'd been built for exactly this purpose. Pike said nothing grows in canyon seeps. "Pike," Eliza said, "hasn't grown anything in his life." Caleb was quiet. The fire popped. "We stay?" he asked. She looked around the canyon. Then she looked down at the tin box in her lap. Then she looked at her sleeping son. "We stay," she said. She didn't say it like it was a decision. She said it like it was a fact that had already been determined, and they were only just now catching up to it. What neither of them knew, lying in that small canyon under that strip of stars, was that their decision to stay would eventually make them a target, that the water running through those 3 quiet seeps would become the most fought-over thing in the territory, to certain, that those men had money and lawyers and survey documents and no interest whatsoever in whether a family had poured their last reserves into the earth. But that was not yet. That night, for the first time in 11 days, Caleb Rourke slept through without waking, and Eliza lay beside him with her hand still resting on the tin seed box, already planning in her mind where the terraces would go, how the water could be directed, which seeds wanted sun, and which would do better against the north wall in the afternoon shade. Her mind moved over the canyon floor like she was walking it already, stone by stone. She'd been afraid, crossing Arizona. She was still afraid, if she was honest. But for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, the fear was standing next to something else. Something that didn't have a name yet, but felt in the dark of that hidden canyon like it might be the beginning of something she'd stopped believing she'd find. Most of its windows were dark. She pressed her palm against the cool earth and felt the faint moisture of the seeps squeaking through the rock below her. It was still there, still running, still real. She closed her eyes. She pressed her palm against the cool earth and felt the faint, steady moisture of the seeps working through the rock below her, and by the time the sun cleared the canyon rim the next morning, she was already awake and on her feet. There was no slow start to that first real day inside the canyon. No easing to it. Dark. The light came over the east wall in a narrow wedge that traveled across the canyon floor like something with purpose, and when it found Eliza, she was already crouching beside the nearest seep, studying the way the water moved down the rock face. Caleb woke to find her tracing lines in the dirt with her finger, not absent-mindedly, not idly, but with the concentrated focus of someone solving a problem they'd been working on for hours. "You sleep at all?" he asked. He looked at the lines she'd drawn. They branched and curved across the packed earth in a rough diagram that meant nothing to him yet. "What's this?" "Water," she said, "where it needs to go." She pointed to 3 spots. "These are the seeps. This is where the soil's deepest against the north wall. If we cut a channel here," and here she drew connecting lines, "we can move the water without losing most of it to evaporation. Caleb studied the diagram. He'd been farming longer than Eliza had, technically. He'd grown up on a working farm in Missouri, understood planting schedules, knew soil composition better than most men he'd met. But he'd never once in his life looked at a water problem the way Eliza was looking at it right now. She saw the canyon differently than he did. He saw obstacles. She saw a system that wasn't finished yet. Stone basins, she said, under each seep. We catch what comes off the rock before it soaks into the ground. Then channels carved shallow enough to hold water, but deep enough that it doesn't just spread and disappear. That's a lot of cutting. Yes. Into sandstone. Yes, Caleb. She looked up at him with an expression that was patient, the way a good teacher is patient, not condescending, just steady. We have time. We have rock. We don't have much else, so let's start with what we have. Tobin appeared from under the blanket he'd burrowed into against the wagon wheel, hair sticking in 4 directions, looking at them both with the serious morning face of a child who had overheard adult conversation and was trying to work out what role he was meant to play. "Can I help?" he asked. "You can hold things," Eliza told him. "That's important work." He considered this with appropriate gravity and nodded. What followed next was not heroic. It was not the kind of work that looks good from a distance or sounds impressive when described in simple terms. Most of its windows were dark. It was brutal, grinding, repetitive work of the kind that breaks people who aren't already broken and makes already broken people either quit or find out what they're actually made of. Caleb started on the basins. He had a chisel and a short-handled pick, and he went at the sandstone beneath the first seep with methodical violence, chipping out a shallow depression that would catch the seeping water before it could spread and sink into the ground. The sandstone was not soft. It resisted. His hands blistered and bled by the second, scabbed by the fourth, and grew hard by the end of the first week in the way hands do, when they have no alternative. Eliza worked the channels. She had a system for it that she'd worked out in her head before she touched a single stone. The channels had to slope not too steep, or the water would run fast and thin and evaporate before it arrived anywhere useful, not too flat, or it would pool and go stagnant. She cut them with a sharpened stake and then smoothed the bottom with a flat piece of sandstone she'd found near the canyon floor, and she sealed the worst cracks with packed clay she discovered in a seam near the base of the north wall. She moved slowly, carefully on her knees. For most of it, her heavy body pressed close to the ground, her forearms red with dust and effort. Tobin held things. He held the water bag. He held the spare chisel when Caleb wasn't using it. He held rocks that needed to be moved 2 feet to the left and rocks that needed to be moved 4 feet to the right. And he held his father's hat. The work got too intense for hats. And he held his question mostly until evening, when they all sat together and Eliza would answer whatever had been building up in him all day. "How does water come out of rock?" he asked on the 3rd evening. "It soaks in from somewhere higher up," Eliza said. "Rain falls on the mesa. Takes years sometimes. Finds its way through cracks until it can't go any further and comes out." Tobin looked at the seeps. "So the water up there came down here slow?" "Very slow," he thought about that. "Like us," he said. Caleb and Eliza looked at each other over the boy's head. "Yeah," Caleb said, "like us." The base seep was finished in 6 days. It was not a beautiful thing. Caleb had no training in stonework and wasn't pretending otherwise, but it held. It collected the water in a shallow pool, roughly 2 feet across and 8 inches deep, and when the first channel connected it to the depression Eliza had prepared at the base of the north wall, she sat back on her heels and watched the water move. Slow, thin as a thread, but moving in the direction she'd intended. She didn't celebrate. She moved to the second seep and started planning the next basin. The soil problem came next, and this one almost broke Caleb. The canyon floor was stone and packed earth, not the kind of earth you grow things in. It had organic material in it, the way old rock has organic material, traces, history, potential, but nothing a bean seedling could use right now. Eliza had known from the first morning. She'd known it and hadn't said anything because some problems you can only fix one piece at a time, and the water problem had to come first. But now the water was moving, and the soil problem was sitting there waiting. "There's a dry wash," Caleb said one evening, unfolding the rough survey map Pike had left him. 2 miles east. Washes accumulate sediment. Should be decent soil down in the bed. How much do we need? He looked at the area she'd indicated for the first terrace. More than we can carry in one trip. Then we make more than one trip. He looked at her. Eliza, it's 2 miles each way. I know how far 2 miles is, Caleb. The first hauling day, they loaded every bucket and bag they owned onto the wagon, drove 2 miles east, loaded everything with the dark alluvial soil from the wash bed, drove 2 miles back, carried it bucket by bucket through the canyon crack, and unloaded it at the base of the north wall. The passage was the worst part of it to the learning side. The bucket in one hand dragged along the stone, unable to move fast, the loaded weight pulling against the awkward angle of the body. Caleb made 11 round trips through the passage that first day. Eliza made 9, which was more than she should have attempted, given the grinding pressure of the stone against her broad frame with a heavy bucket in her hands. She didn't make a sound about it. Her forearms, when she finally set down the last bucket in the fading light, scraped raw from wrist to elbow on both sides. Caleb saw it and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would change what had to happen tomorrow. He tore strips from the bottom edge of an old shirt and wrapped her arms without asking permission, and she let him do it without comment. And that was how it was with them, the kind of marriage that had burned through its need for somewhere back in Kansas and settled into something quieter and more durable. They made 7 hauling trips over 3 weeks. 7 trips, 2 miles each way, buckets through the crack, soil piled against the north wall. Tobin carried what he could. He was 5 and small, but he was serious about it, and Eliza never once told him his load didn't matter. By the 4th week, she was ready to build the terraces. This was the part of the work that surprised Caleb most. He'd expected Eliza to be competent at it. She was competent at most practical things she turned her attention to, but he hadn't expected her to be good at it. Really good. She had an instinct for how the stone had to sit, which piece went, how to angle the face of the wall so that when water hit it, the moisture would be directed inward rather than running off. She would pick up a flat piece of sandstone, look at it for a moment, turn it twice in her hands, and place it exactly where it needed to go. Where'd you learn that? Caleb asked her one afternoon. She wiped dust from her face with the back of her wrist. I didn't. I'm figuring it out. Looks like you've done it before. She shook her head. I just look at what it's doing and figure out what it needs. She sat back and studied the first terrace wall. 18 inches high, rough-faced, packed tight with the red clay she'd been using as mortar. Behind it, 18 inches of dark, moisture-holding soil. It needs to not fall, she said, and it needs to keep the water where the roots can reach it. Everything else is just details. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're better at this than I am." She looked at him. He meant it straight, no bitterness, no edge, just a plain observation from a man who'd spent enough time lying to himself about his own limitations that honesty felt like relief. She recognized that, and she appreciated it. "You're better at the channels," she told him. "They're straight. Mine would wander." He almost smiled. Little bit. She picked up the next stone. By the 5th week, she had 3 terrace walls standing. By the 6th, she had 5. The canyon floor, which had been flat, bare rock and packed dirt when they arrived, was developing a kind of stepped architecture against the north wall, each terrace a foot to 18 inches high, each one holding a layer of dark soil that deepened as more hauling trips added to it. And then she opened the tin box. She waited until a particular morning when the light was right, and the air in the canyon had that specific quality she'd been waiting for, cooler than the weeks before, a shift in the smell of things that she couldn't have explained to anyone else but recognized. She sat on the lowest terrace wall with the box on her knee and Tobin beside her, and she opened it. The seeds were in small cloth envelopes, each one labeled in her handwriting. She'd checked them twice during the crossing, once in New Mexico, and once after a particularly brutal night when she'd been afraid the heat had killed them. They were still viable. She'd tested a few beans by putting them in damp cloth 2 days before she opened the box, and they'd shown the faint swell of germination within 36 hours. "What are those?" Tobin asked. "These are beans," she said, holding up the envelope. "These are squash, lettuce, turnips, onions." She held up another envelope with special care. "Strawberries." And these, she reached into the bottom of the box and removed a piece of damp cloth she'd rewrapped 3 times. Since Kansas, these are grapes. Tobin looked at the small wrapped bundle. "They look dead." "They're not dead." "How do you know?" She pressed the cloth gently between her palms. Because I haven't let them be. She planted the beans first, pushing each one into the second terrace with her thumb, at the depth and spacing she'd learned from her mother 20 years ago in Ohio. Beans into the second terrace. Squash along the top terrace where the sun hit longest. Lettuce and onions lower, where the afternoon shadow would spare them from the worst heat. Turnips in the deepest soil at the base of the north wall, where the seep moisture ran longest. The strawberry runners went last, pressed carefully into soil she'd prepared separately, mixed with the dark clay from the canyon wall seam and the alluvial wash soil in a ratio she'd worked out in her head over several nights. The grape cuttings she planted herself, alone, at the far end of the lowest terrace, pressed into the deepest soil against the warmest section of the south-facing canyon wall. She did this while Caleb was working on the cabin framing and Tobin was asleep in the shade. She did it quietly, not because she was hiding it, but because some things need to be done in a particular kind of silence. She sat there afterward with her dirty hands in her lap, 3 cuttings. After everything they'd been through to get here, it came down to 3 small sticks pressed into the earth of a hidden canyon in the Arizona Territory. She was not a person who prayed. She hadn't been since she was a girl. But she sat there for a while in the warm quiet of that canyon, and she said something to nobody in particular under her breath. And then she got up and went back to work. 9 days after planting, Tobin screamed from the garden. Not a frightened scream. A completely different kind of scream, the kind children produce when something they've been watching and waiting for, finally, impossibly, actually happens. Caleb dropped the hammer he was using on the cabin frame and ran. Eliza was already moving from the channel she'd been clearing, moving faster than she'd moved in weeks. Tobin was on his knees in front of the second terrace. 14 bean seedlings. Pale green, fragile as paper, barely an inch tall, but unmistakably there, unmistakably alive, pushing up through the dark soil in the morning light. Caleb crouched beside his son and stared at them. Eliza came up behind them both and looked over their shoulders. She stood very still for a moment. Then she exhaled, long, slow, the kind of breath that carries something heavy out of the body when it goes. 14, Tobin said. I counted. Good counting, Eliza said. Are they going to be okay? She looked at the seedlings, at the soil, at the channel line running beside the terrace that delivered water steadily from the North Seep Basin, at the terrace wall, holding everything in place, at the angle of the morning sun hitting exactly the right section of the terrace at exactly the right time of day. Yes, she said. They're going to be okay. She meant it. She knew enough to mean it. Over the following weeks, the canyon changed. It changed the way things change when they're alive, not in sudden dramatic moments, but in gradual, accumulating increments that you almost don't notice day to day until one morning you look up and something is completely different from what it was before. The bean plants reached 4 inches, then 8, then started to vine. The squash spread across the top terrace with the cheerful aggression of a plant that has decided it owns the place. Lettuce came in thick and fast. Onion shoots appeared as thin green lines against the dark soil. Caleb finished the cabin against the East Canyon wall. It wasn't grand one room, stone walls chinked with clay, a roof of rough timber he'd hauled through the crack a beam at a time, a single window facing west to catch the afternoon light. The door was lower than he'd wanted, because the timber he had wasn't long enough, and for the first month he hit his head on the frame at least once a day. And the 4th time he did it, he said something that made Eliza look at him with raised eyebrows, and Tobin asked what that word meant, and Caleb said it was a word for when you hit your head. The boy stored that information away. It wasn't a perfect cabin. It wasn't even close to perfect. The floor was bare stone. The window let in more wind than light in the evenings. The roof leaked in 2 places when the rare desert rain came, and Caleb spent an entire night awake in August, holding a bucket under the worst one while Eliza slept through the whole thing, which he considered either impressive or aggravating, and he hadn't fully decided which. But it held. And by the time the summer heat began to tip toward the first suggestion of fall, the Rourkes were eating from the canyon. Not much at first. A handful of beans from the first harvest, tough and stringy but real. Lettuce that tasted of nothing so much as water, which was exactly what they needed. Onions to its windows were dark. Onions in the soil with a satisfaction Caleb had never felt pulling an onion before, because every onion in the ground was an argument against everything Pike had said about canyon seeps. Eliza ate the first bean from the first harvest, standing in the garden, not at the table. She bit into it and chewed and swallowed and just stood there for a moment with her eyes on the middle distance. Well, Caleb asked. Stringy, she said, but it's ours. Tobin ate 4 of them raw before she could stop him, and then complained about his stomach that evening, and Eliza told him that was the consequence of not asking first, and he said he had been hungry, and she said she understood that but consequences didn't care about reasons, and Caleb stayed out of it entirely because he had learned, over 5 years of fatherhood, when to be invisible. The turnips came in better than the beans, fat and purple-shouldered, heavier than she'd expected from the soil composition, a small buried treasure pulled up each time with a kind of stubborn resistance that made pulling them satisfying, in a way that other vegetables weren't. Eliza stacked them in the corner of the root cellar space she'd carved into the base of the canyon wall, not a real root cellar yet, just a deep alcove that stayed significantly cooler than the open air, but it was enough to extend the storage life of everything she put in it. She was doing the accounts in her head every evening, how much they were producing, how much they were eating, how much would need to be stored to carry them through winter, how much they could possibly produce from a garden this size with this much water, and then she'd push beyond that calculation to the one that mattered more. How much more could they produce if the irrigation was extended, if the terraces were expanded, if the grape cuttings established themselves and came in productive in 2 or 3 years? The grape cuttings were alive. She checked them every morning first thing, before she checked anything else. 3 small sticks in the soil at the far end of the lowest terrace, and by the 6th week after planting, one of them, just one, showed the faint budding of a leaf node, the tiniest possible evidence of life. She crouched beside it and looked at it for a long moment, and then stood up and told nobody, because she'd decided she wasn't going to say anything about the grapes until there was something worth saying. But she knew. The travelers started appearing in early September. The first one was harmless, a single man on a mule heading south, who'd seen the wagon tracks leading to the canyon wall and followed them out of curiosity. He came through the crack at Caleb's invitation, stood in the canyon looking at the terraces and the garden and the cabin with an expression that moved through surprise, disbelief, and something close to envy in the space of about seconds. "You did all this?" he said. "We did," Caleb said. The man looked at Eliza in the garden. He looked at the bean plants, climbing the stone she'd propped up for them. He looked at the water moving in the channel. He shook his head slowly, the way people shake their heads when they see something that doesn't fit the categories they have for it. And he said, "Well, I'll be..." And then he left, and that was that. The second traveler was a couple of daughters moving west, using the same general track the Rourkes had used to reach the canyon. They were thirsty, and the man's wife had a fever, and Caleb gave them water from the basin without hesitation. And Eliza gave them a portion of what she'd set aside for their own dinner that evening, and the family left grateful and exhausted. And that night, Eliza recalculated her storage numbers and adjusted for the portion she'd given away, moving figures around in her head until everything still added up. Caleb watched her doing the silent arithmetic across the dinner table. "We could have kept it," he said. "They needed it more. We might need it come January. Then we'll deal with January in January." She said it flatly, not unkindly, the way she said most things that weren't open for further discussion. He didn't argue. The third traveler was different. His name was Vernon Slade, and he arrived one morning in mid-September with 2 men riding beside him on horses that were too well fed to belong to people who were passing through. He was not physically imposing medium height, lean, somewhere in his 50s with a face that had the weathered, calculating look of a man who'd spent decades watching other people's decisions for weaknesses. He wore a decent coat despite the heat, which meant he was the kind of man who wore a decent coat to remind you he could afford one. He came through the crack like everyone else, but unlike everyone else, he didn't stop to look at the garden or the cabin or the water. He looked at the seeps, just the seeps. He walked directly to the nearest one and crouched, and pressed his hand against the wet stone and looked at the water running down, and he stayed there longer than was natural, and something in the way he did it made the skin on the back of Eliza's neck tighten in a way she couldn't have explained. Mr. Rourke. He didn't offer a hand when he stood up. Vernon Slade. I run cattle on the basin land east of here. 200 head. He said it the way men say things when they want you to know a number. That's quite a few, Caleb said. He was standing near the cabin door with his arms loose, side not aggressive, but not relaxed either. Water's the thing out here. You know that. Slade looked around the canyon with a slow measuring scan. 3 seeps feeding into this system. That's significant. It is. How much you pulling per day, you think? Caleb looked at him. Enough for a garden. Right, Slade smiled, which didn't reach anything above his jawline. And this is your land, all this? Filed at the territorial office. Continuous occupation. Improvements documented. Slade made a small sound that wasn't agreement and wasn't disagreement. He looked again at the seeps. Then he looked at Eliza, who had stopped working in the garden and was standing 20 feet away with a flat piece of sandstone in her hands and an expression on her face that Caleb recognized as the one she wore when she was being very careful not to show what she was actually thinking. You've done well here, Slade said. Better than most would have. Thank you, Caleb said. Must be hard, hauling soil, building all this. He gestured vaguely at the terraces, especially with a family. He paused, and the pause had something in it. If you ever found yourselves in a difficult position financially, I'd be prepared to discuss a fair arrangement regarding the water access. Silence. Caleb held it for 3 full seconds before he answered. We're not in a difficult position. Slade looked at him steadily. Not now. Not now, Caleb agreed, and I expect not later either. But I appreciate you stopping by. It was a dismissal, delivered with complete pleasantness and zero ambiguity. Slade heard it. His 2 men heard it. There was a moment where the air in the canyon had a particular quality, the kind of stillness that collects, right before something decides which way it's going to go. Then Slade nodded, once slowly, and walked back toward the passage. At the entrance he turned. Water in this territory is worth more than land, he said, worth more than most things. You remember that. Then he went through the crack and he was gone. Caleb waited until the sound of hooves faded before he turned to look at Eliza. She was still holding the piece of sandstone. Her knuckles were white around it. He's going to come back, she said. Caleb said nothing, because she was right and they both knew it, and there was no comfort available in pretending otherwise. What they didn't know yet was that Slade wasn't coming back alone, that somewhere in Tucson a lawyer's office was already being retained, that a document was being pulled from a filing cabinet, an old survey, years old, with a particular boundary description that someone had decided was worth money if it could be made to stick. That the Red Basin Land Company, which most people had never heard of, and which had existed largely on paper for the better part of a decade, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity, was about to become the most significant threat to everything the Rourkes had spent the summer building. But that was not today. Today Eliza set down the piece of sandstone and went back to her terraces, and Caleb went back to the root cellar alcove he was expanding. Most of its windows were dark, and Tobin came running from wherever he'd been hiding during the conversation news with the serious that one of the squash on the upper terrace was the biggest squash he'd ever seen in his life. Eliza told him to come show her, and he took her hand and pulled her up the terrace steps she'd built, and she stood at the top of the canyon garden and looked at the squash, which was indeed impressively large, and then she looked out at the whole of it. The terraces, the channels, the bean plants climbing, the onions and turnips below, the cottonwood by the seeps, greener now than it had been when they'd arrived, the cabin against the east wall, the basket she'd woven from dry grass hanging by the door. She'd been afraid, standing at the crack in the canyon wall that first day, that it was too much to ask, too much work, too much faith, too much of everything they didn't have enough of. She'd gone through the crack anyway, because the alternative was getting back on the wagon and rolling forward into another blank horizon, with her tin box and her seeds and nothing to put them in. She stood at the top of the terrace and breathed the cool canyon air. And somewhere below her, in the soil at the far end of the lowest terrace, 3 grape cuttings were putting down roots. 2 of them were still uncertain. But the one with the leaf node, the one she checked every morning first thing, the one she'd said nothing about to anyone, had opened a second leaf since the morning. This she hadn't told Caleb. She'd tell him when there was more to tell. For now she turned to Tobin and agreed with him completely that the squash was extraordinary. and the boy beamed like he'd grown it himself, which in a way he had, because he'd carried water to it twice a week in the small clay pot she'd given him for exactly that purpose. And she never let him forget that his water made a difference. Because it did. Every bit of it did. That was the thing she kept coming back to, in the quiet of the early mornings before Caleb and Tobin were up, and the canyon was just her, and the seeps and the sound of water moving through channels she'd cut herself. Nothing here was wasted. Nothing here was given. Every green thing in this canyon existed because someone had decided it was going to exist, and then had done the work to make that decision mean something. She was not going to let Vernon Slade's careful smile and his horses that were too well fed and his talk about water rights and difficult positions take that away. She was not. But she also understood, in the practical, clear-eyed way she understood most things, that wanting something and keeping it were two different problems, and the second one was about to get considerably harder. The morning after Slade left, Eliza woke before the sun cleared the canyon rim and lay still in the dark listening to the seeps. She could hear them from the cabin. If the night was quiet enough, a faint, continuous sound, barely louder than breathing. The water finding its way through stone, the way it had been finding its way, for longer than anyone could calculate. She lay there and listened and thought about what Slade had said. Not the words he'd used, because the words were just courtesy wrapped around a threat. She thought about the way he'd looked at the seeps, the way he'd pressed his hand against the wet stone and stayed there too long. Like he was already measuring something. She'd met men like that before. Not many, but enough. Men who saw things someone else had built and looked at it not with admiration, but with a quiet, calculating hunger, turning it over in their minds to figure out what it would cost to take it. The thing that scared her about Slade more than his money, more than his 2 well-fed horses and his decent coat, was that he hadn't been angry. Angry men were predictable. Angry men acted fast and made mistakes. Slade had been patient. He'd smiled at the right moments, and he'd delivered his warning gently, and patient men who smile at the right moments are the ones who come back prepared. She got up. She didn't wake Caleb. She pulled on her dress in the dark, picked up her boots, and went outside barefoot, sitting on the stone step of the cabin to lace them while the first gray light felt its way down the canyon walls. She went to check the grape cuttings. The second leaf on the strongest cutting had opened fully overnight. She crouched beside it in the half-dark and put her face close to the soil to look, and what she saw was small and fragile and absolutely real. She stayed there for a moment with her hands on her knees. Then she stood up, straightened her dress, and went back to start the morning fire. When Caleb came out of the cabin 20 minutes later, rubbing his jaw with the back of his hand and squinting at the light, she handed him coffee, real coffee, the last of what they'd bought at the trading post, kept for mornings that needed it, and said, "We need to document everything." He looked at her over the rim of the tin cup. "What do you mean, document?" "The improvements. The cabin. The basins. The channels. The terraces. Everything we've built written down with dates. If Slade comes back with anything legal, we need our occupation to be on paper." He was quiet for a moment. "You think he'll come back with something legal?" "I think he'll come back with something. Legal is the polite version." Caleb drank his coffee. He was not by nature a man who moved fast on decisions. He thought things through, turned them over, checked them from different angles before committing. It was one of the things that had frustrated Eliza early in their marriage when she confused it with hesitation. She'd learned eventually that they were different things. Hesitation was fear. Caleb's slowness was methodology. "All right," he said finally. "We document." That same afternoon, Caleb sat at the small table he'd built against the cabin wall and wrote out everything he could account for in the expedition journal he'd kept since Kansas. Not a diary, he wasn't a diary man, but a practical record of dates and decisions and things that happened that seemed worth remembering. He added to it now, with specific intention, the date they'd entered the canyon, the date each basin was completed, the dates the channels were finished, the date Eliza planted, the date the first seedlings emerged, the date the cabin was finished. He wrote it plainly, without flourish, in the straightforward hand of a man who'd had a Missouri schoolhouse education and nothing more. Eliza added her own notes in the margin, specific details about the terrace dimensions, the soil composition, the yield estimates from the first harvest. Her handwriting was smaller and more precise than his, and she packed more information into each line. The journal, when they finished, was 22 pages of continuous occupation. It was not a legal document. It had no stamps or signatures or official seals. But it was dated and consistent and specific, and that specificity, Caleb had learned in his years of dealing with land offices, was what separated a filing that survived from one that didn't. He put it in the tin box with Eliza's seeds. She raised an eyebrow at that. "Safest place I know," he said. She didn't argue. October came into the canyon sideways. The way fall comes to desert country, not with the dramatic color change of eastern forests, but with a shift in the quality of the light, a drop in the nighttime temperature that changed from uncomfortable to serious, a dryness to the air that had an edge in it. The garden slowed. The beans that had been climbing enthusiastically through September put out their last pods and began to yellow at the edges. The squash hardened on their vines. The lettuce bolted in the last warm week, and Eliza let it go to seed, collecting every possible seed and adding it to the tin box with careful labeling. She was already planning next year. That was the thing Caleb noticed most about his wife through that fall, the way she thought in cycles rather than moments. He was focused on now, the food they had, the firewood they needed, the roof seam that was still leaking and would be a problem once the winter rains came. Eliza thought in seasons. She was harvesting this year's squash with one hand and planning next year's terrace expansion with the other part of her mind, already calculating where the water could be extended. How many additional square feet of soil could be brought in during the winter months when there was nothing else demanding the hauling days? Tobin had taken over watering duty entirely by October. He had a system, 2 clay pots, one larger, one smaller, which he filled from the first basin and carried to the plants on a route he'd established himself, starting at the top terrace and working down because he'd figured out on his own that going downhill with full pots was easier than going uphill. He was 5, moving towards 6, and he was running a functional irrigation shift twice a day without being asked. Eliza watched him one morning from across the canyon, this small, serious boy moving up and down some of the terrace steps with his pots, his face set in concentration, and she felt something tighten in her chest that wasn't entirely comfortable. It was the feeling of understanding, for the first time, that your child has become a person, not just yours a person, with their own methodology and their own logic and their own particular way of moving through the world. "He's going to be all right," Caleb said, appearing beside her. He'd seen where she was looking. "I know," she said. "That's what I'm afraid of." He looked at her sideways. "That doesn't make sense." "It makes complete sense." She looked away from Tobin and back at the terrace wall she was repointing with fresh clay. "When they're small enough to carry, you know they're safe. When they start being all right on their own, you realize you can't always be between them and everything." Caleb was quiet. "You can't be between them and everything anyway." "No," she said, "but you can pretend." He put his hand on her shoulder briefly, not a gesture he made often. He was not a physically demonstrative man, and then went back to his work, and she went back to hers. Orson Pike returned in the 3rd week of October. He didn't come through the crack this time. He stopped at the canyon entrance and called out, the way people announce themselves when they're not sure they're welcome. And Caleb went to the passage and came out on the other side to meet him. Eliza heard the voices from inside the garden and set down her trowel and stayed very still, listening. She couldn't hear the words clearly, but she heard the tone, Caleb's voice, flat and controlled. Pike's voice, higher, talking faster than he should have been. The sound of something being unfolded paper, maybe. She picked up her trowel again and continued working, because panicking before what she was dealing with was a luxury she couldn't afford and never had been able to. Caleb came back through the crack 12 minutes later. He had a look on his face she knew. Not anger. Caleb's anger was quiet and still, not expressed in his face. This was the look he got. This was the look he got when something he'd been half expecting finally arrived, and he was deciding how much of his reaction to show. Pike was with a legal representative, he said. She kept her hands moving in the soil. And he had a document, a survey claim, filed by something called the Red Basin Land Company. They're asserting prior rights to the seep system that feeds this canyon. He paused. They're saying the water isn't ours. She stopped. She looked up at him. On what basis? She asked. 1,879 survey. Before we were here, claims that a prior measurement established the seep system as part of the Red Basin watershed, which apparently falls under a blanket land grant the company holds. He sat down on the stone step of the cabin. Pike delivered it as a courtesy. Said the company's legal man would be back in 30 days with a formal notice. 30 days. Eliza sat back on her heels and looked at the terraces, at the channels she'd cut, at the water moving in them, steady as breath, the same water that had been moving through this rock long before any survey and would be moving long after every document ever filed was dust. She looked at the bean plants, yellow now, but having given them everything they had, at the squash lined up against the cabin wall, waiting to go into storage, at the turnips still in the ground, fat and real. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "How Tucson? Territorial Land Office. I take the journal, I take our filing documents, and I go look at what this survey actually says and whether it actually says what Pike claims it says." He looked at her. "That means leaving you here, alone, for however long it takes." She looked at him for a moment. "How long?" "Week, maybe 2. It depends on how backed up the office is and how much they'll let me look at." "You think there's something wrong with the survey?" Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. "Pike's nervous." The legal man was nervous. Men who have a solid legal position don't send a surveyor to deliver the notice, they send their lawyer directly. They're testing whether we'll just leave. Eliza stood up. She brushed the dirt from her dress. It didn't help much. The dress was beyond help and stood straight and looked at her husband with the clear practical gaze she'd been pointing at problems since Ohio. "Then go," she said. "Go look at the survey. Take the journal. Take our filing. Eliza, I know how to use the rifle. I know how to send Tobin through the crack, to flag someone down on the trail if I need help. I know how to keep this garden alive." She said it not with bravado, but with the simple authority of someone listening facts. "What I can't do is go to the Tucson Land Office and read survey documents. You can, so you go do that and I'll do this." He looked at her for a long time. She had a scrape across her left cheekbone from where she'd caught a piece of sandstone that morning, and her hair was tied back with a strip of the same shirt he'd used to bandage her arms 2 months ago, and she was standing in a canyon garden. She'd built essentially from nothing with a look on her face that said she had not come through 3 territories and 11 days of brutal trail and a crack in a sandstone wall to surrender anything to anyone. "All right," he said. He left before dawn 2 days later. Eliza stood at the canyon entrance and watched the wagon move down the trail until she couldn't see it anymore. Then she went back through the crack and stood in the garden in the early gray light and looked at everything. Hers to protect. She turned around and went to the cabin and told Tobin that Papa had gone to Tucson for a while on important business, and Tobin accepted this with the practical fatalism of a frontier child who had learned that important business happened and you worked around it, and asked if he still needed to do his watering shift. "Yes," Eliza said, "and mine too until I say different." He nodded. "Okay." She picked up her trowel. The first week without Caleb was hard in a logistical way. All the work that 2 people had divided fell to one large, tired woman and one small boy, and there was no pretending otherwise. Caleb handled the heavy stone moving, the tool repairs, the constant maintenance of the channel walls that the shifting canyon earth pushed out of alignment a little more each. Without him, Eliza moved slower on those tasks, because some of the stones she could manage alone and some she couldn't, and she had to figure out which was which before she hurt herself trying the wrong ones. She hurt herself once. Her 4th day alone, moving a flat piece of sandstone that she'd decided was in the manageable category, and that turned out not to be. It shifted wrong and came down across her left hand, and she sat on the ground for 10 minutes holding her hand against her body, with her eyes closed, breathing through it, before she could look at it. 2 fingers badly bruised, the smallest one possibly cracked. She couldn't tell from looking. She wrapped it tight, splinted the small finger against the ring finger with 2 sticks and a strip of cloth, and went back to work. She did not write this in the journal. Some things were between her and the canyon. Tobin found her sitting by the seeps that evening with her wrapped hand in the cold basin water, which was the only pain relief available. He sat beside her without comment. She didn't explain. After a while he said, "Does it hurt bad?" "Some." Papa would say, "Don't do things the wrong way." Papa would be right. What's the wrong way? Thinking you can lift something because you need to instead of because you can. She pulled her hand out of the water and looked at it. The swelling was not getting worse, which she counted as good news. There's a difference between stubborn and stupid. Tobin, try to know which one you're being. He thought about this seriously. How do you know? You get older. You get hurt a few times. Eventually, you develop a feeling for it. She wrapped her hand back in the cloth. I'm still developing. He leaned against her arm. She let him. The second week was harder in a different way. The logistical problems she was managing, slowly, imperfectly, but managing. What the second week brought was the kind of hard that doesn't have a solution you can work toward. The waiting. The not knowing what Caleb was finding in Tucson. The not knowing if Pike's company had anything real, or if it was just paper and pressure designed to make a tired family on a new homestead decide the fight wasn't worth it. She found herself talking to the grape cuttings. Not conversation, she wasn't having a breakdown, she was clear-eyed about the difference. She just crouched beside them in the morning and reported briefly on the status of things. The way you'd talk to someone who was asleep and might or might not be able to hear you, but whom you felt better addressing directly. Still here, she'd say. Second seep's running clean. Tobin's managing the watering, and then she'd check the soil moisture and the leaf development and stand up and get on with the day. The strongest cutting now had 4 leaves. The second cutting had produced 2. The third was still uncertain. It hadn't died, but it wasn't clearly alive either, hovering in that frustrating middle ground where you couldn't make a decision about it either way. She left it in the ground. She'd decided long ago that she didn't pull things out of the earth until she was absolutely certain they were finished. Vernon Slade came on the 9th day. He came alone this time, without his 2 men, which was either a gesture of good faith or a calculation that a lone approach would be less alarming, and therefore more likely to get him through the crack before she'd had time to think about it. She heard the sound of a single horse on the trail outside the canyon and went to stand near the passage entrance, without going through it. Mrs. Rourke. His voice came through the crack clearly. I was hoping to speak with your husband. He's not here, she said. A pause. Is he expected back soon? When his business is finished. Another pause. She could hear him deciding something. Perhaps I could speak with you then. Just briefly. She thought about the rifle. She had it. She also had no reason yet to need it, and showing it before you needed, it was a way of escalating things you might be able to resolve without escalation. She'd learned that from watching the men who'd pushed her family off 2 farms, they'd looked for anger to justify themselves. She wasn't going to give Slade that. Come through, she said. He came through the crack and stood in the canyon and looked around. He looked at the garden differently than he had the first time, not at the seeps now, but at the work itself, the terraces, the surviving crops, the cabin. He took it in with an expression that she couldn't quite read, which bothered her. You've done more, he said, since I was here last. That's what we do. He looked at her hand, the wrapped fingers, the splint. She'd kept working with it for 4 days, and the wrap was dirty, and the cloth was beginning to fray at the edges. She hadn't thought about what it looked like until she caught him looking at it. You're managing alone, he said. I'm managing. He nodded slowly. He walked to the low wall of the first terrace and stood with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the bean plants that were finished now, yellow and dry, their work done for the season. The company doesn't want to fight with you, he said. Then they're going about things oddly. His mouth moved almost a smile. Not quite. They want the water access, not the land, specifically. If there were a way to negotiate a shared arrangement, there isn't. He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd come through the crack. She met it. She was not going to look away from Vernon Slade or from any other man who wanted her to feel smaller than she was. Mrs. Rourke, he said, and his voice shifted slightly lower without the careful pleasantness he'd been wearing. The company's survey predates your filing by 9 years. That's a significant legal advantage in any territorial court. Then I suppose the territorial court will sort it out. Courts take time. Money, he let that sit for a moment. And determinations can go different ways. She looked at him steadily. Are you threatening me, Mr. Slade? I'm giving you practical information. That's one name for it. She took one step toward him, not aggressive, just refusing to let the distance he'd put between them stand as a comfort to him. My husband is in Tucson right now looking at that survey. If it holds up, we'll deal with that. If it doesn't, we'll deal with that instead. Either way, the answer to any arrangement regarding our water is no. It was no when you came the first time. It was no before you came the first time. and it will be no when you come back again, because men like you always come back again." Slade looked at her. The calculating expression had shifted into something harder to categorize. He wasn't angry, she'd half expected anger, and had prepared for it. He was doing something else with his face. Reassessing, maybe. The way you reassess a piece of terrain you've been moving through casually and have just realized is more complicated than it looked from a distance. He left without saying anything more. Eliza stood in the middle of the canyon garden for a long time after the sound of his horse faded. Her heart was going hard. She'd felt it the whole time he was there and had not shown it, and now that he was gone, she was letting herself feel it fully, the particular fear that comes not from a raised voice or a visible threat, but from a patient, smiling man who has more resources than you and knows it. She looked at her wrapped hand. Then she went and found Tobin, who was at the upper terrace checking on the squash that remained, and she told him that a man named Slade had been here, and that if he ever came back while Caleb was away, Tosin was to come and find her immediately and not talk to him. Tobin processed this. "Is he bad? I don't know yet," she said. "That's why we're careful. Papa says be careful with men who smile too much." She looked at her son. "Your papa is right about that." Caleb came back on the 14th day. Eliza heard the wagon on the trail in the early afternoon and went to the canyon entrance and waited, and she heard him call out before he came through the crack. "It's me, Eliza." I'm back the way he'd learned to announce himself when coming home in uncertain country, so she wouldn't be waiting with the rifle at the wrong angle. He came through the passage and straightened and looked at her hand and said, "What happened?" "Stone moved the wrong way. Tell me about the survey." He looked at her for another moment. She could see him deciding whether to push on the hand question, and then he read her face and let it go. "I found something," he said. They sat on the terrace wall, the two of them, while Tobin ran back to his watering route that had been waiting for him to finish his reunion with his father. Most of its windows were dark. Caleb pulled the expedition journal from inside his coat and set it on the wall between them, and then he pulled out 3 sheets of paper covered in his own handwriting notes he'd made at the Territorial Land Office and spread them on top of it. "The Red Basin Land Company survey," he said, "was conducted in 1879 by a man named Samuel Orith. It established boundaries for a watershed claim using 6 reference points." He put his finger on the notes. "Reference points 1 through 5 I found on the current territorial maps. They match. They're real rock formations, ridge lines, things you can find. And the 6th? He looked at her. "Reference point 6 is described as the distinctive twin-spired formation at the north terminus of Red Basin Canyon, visible from the established survey line." He paused. "There is no twin-spired formation at the north terminus of Red Basin Canyon." Eliza looked at the notes. "Are you certain?" "I spoke with 3 men at the office. One of them has surveyed that area twice in the last 5 years. He's never seen a twin-spired formation anywhere along that canyon terminus." He put the notes down. If the 6th reference point doesn't exist, if it was a surveying error, or if Orith described something from bad information, or if he fabricated it, then the boundary line that defines their SEEP claim can't be established. Without that boundary, the claim falls apart. Eliza was quiet for a long moment. "That's not the same as proving it's wrong," she said. "No, that's the next step." "The land office clerk man named Merrick," he said, "if I can get a sworn statement from someone who surveyed that area recently, confirming the formation doesn't exist, that's grounds to formally challenge the survey's validity. Can you get that statement?" "The surveyor I spoke to said he'd put it in writing." He was already suspicious of Orith's work. Apparently there were questions about 2 other claims Orith surveyed in the same period. He folded the notes carefully. "Merrick said to bring the statement back along with our filing and the journal. He'll put the challenge on record, and the company will have to respond formally." Eliza looked at the terraces, at the channels, at the water still moving through them in the thin, steady line she'd cut into the stone, and while they're responding formally, she said, "We're still here." "Continuous occupation," Caleb said, "with documented improvements. That matters, Eliza." Merrick was clear about that. "We're not squatters with a verbal claim. We have a filing, a journal, a built structure, and a producing garden. The law recognizes that differently." She breathed in slowly through her nose. The canyon air was cool. Fall was deepening now, and the nights had begun to have a real bite in them. She could smell the dry stone and the last warmth from the soil, and something faintly green from the surviving plants. Slade was here, she said. Caleb went still. When? The 9th day. Alone. He said the company wanted to negotiate water access. I said no. He give you any trouble? He gave me practical information. Her voice was dry. About how courts take time and money and go different ways. Caleb's jaw moved. He was doing the quiet anger thing still. Controlled. The kind that sat behind his eyes and didn't come out in his voice. He said that to you. He's going to say worse when he finds out we've challenged the survey. She looked at her husband. We need to be ready for that. I know. Which means we need Merrick to move fast on the challenge. Before the company's lawyer shows up with the formal notice. If we filed first. I know, Eliza. His voice wasn't sharp, just tired. He'd been writing for 14 days and looking at documents he barely understood and talking to men in offices who held the fate of everything he'd built in their filing systems. He was tired in the specific way of a man who has been fighting on unfamiliar ground. She put her unwrapped hand over his. He looked at her hand, then at her face. When did you splint the finger, he asked. 4th day. Why didn't you? He stopped. What would you have done, she asked. Come back. You were in Tucson. There was nothing to do but wrap it and keep going. He turned his hand over under hers and held it, carefully, being conscious of the injured fingers. Does it hurt? Less than it did. He was quiet. The light was going off the canyon walls in the late afternoon way, the red deepening first to orange, then to something almost purple, before the color dropped out of it entirely. Below them, Tobin was making his last watering round of the day, his small figure moving down the terrace steps with the careful deliberateness of a child who takes his work seriously. We're going to keep it, Caleb said. He said it quietly. Not with triumph. There was nothing to triumph about yet. Just a statement of intention from a man who had spent his last 2 weeks in territorial offices learning how much this land was worth fighting for and had come back with enough to fight with. Eliza looked at the grape cuttings at the far end of the lowest terrace. 4 leaves on the strongest one now, 2 on the second, the third still hovering. Yes, she said. Not because she was certain. She was far from certain. The company had money, and Slade had patience, and the territorial courts had its own rhythms and its own loyalties that had nothing to do with who had actually done the work on any given piece of land. She knew all of that. But she had 3 seeps and a journal and 22 pages of documented occupation and the sworn testimony of a surveyor who'd been in Red Basin Canyon twice and never seen a twin-spired formation that was supposed to be there and wasn't. And she had Caleb, who was tired and road-worn and sitting on a terrace wall she'd built herself, holding her injured hand like it was something he intended to take care of. She had enough. For now, she had enough. What she didn't know yet, what neither of them knew as the light went purple on the canyon walls, and Tobin made his last trip down the terrace steps, was that Edwin Merrick in the Tucson land office had already looked, twice, at the description of that 6th reference point, that he'd pulled Orith's other surveys and found the same name on 2 boundary descriptions that had been quietly contested and quietly settled in the past decade. That the twin-spired formation was not the only thing in the Red Basin survey that didn't exist. But that was in Tucson. Here in the canyon the water ran. Here the turnips were still in the ground, and the squash was against the wall, and the beans were finished, but their seeds were in the tin box, and the grape cuttings were putting down roots in the best soil Eliza had been able to give them. And the canyon held them in its red walls, the way it had been holding things for longer than any survey. Longer than any land company, longer than any document ever filed in any territorial office, patient and indifferent and absolutely, permanently there. Caleb rode back to Tucson 11 days later. He didn't want to. That was the honest truth of it, and he didn't dress it up for Eliza or for himself. The canyon had taken on a particular quality in the weeks since his return. No, not comfortable exactly. Nothing about their life there was comfortable in the way that word usually means, but settled. The kinds of its windows were dark, the kind of settled that comes when people have decided where they stand and the standing has become ordinary. He'd spent those 11 days reinforcing the roof seam that had been leaking since August, extending one of the lower channels to reach the new soil bed. Eliza was preparing against the west wall and splitting firewood from the dry timber he'd hauled through the crack in sections small enough to manage. Normal work. Work that belonged to a place you intended to keep. Riding away from it again felt wrong in his body the way certain wrong decisions feel a tightness across the shoulders, a reluctance in the hands on the reins. But Merrick had sent word through a passing rider headed east. Just 6 words on a torn piece of paper. Come when you can. Bring everything. Those 6 words meant something was moving. Caleb had learned enough about how territorial offices work to know that clerks like Merrick didn't send informal messages through passing riders unless the formal channels were moving too slowly for whatever they needed to say. He told Eliza the morning he left. She was at the west wall, marking out the new bed with seton string she'd made. From dried grass, twisted tight, not professional cordage. It would do for marking and nothing else, but it held the line. She looked at the note. Read it twice. Go, she said. The formal notice from the company's lawyer hasn't come yet. When it comes, I'll manage it. She handed him back the note. You know what Merrick needs from you better than I do. Go get it done. He looked at her for a moment. She had the string in one hand and a stake in the other, and she was looking at him with the expression she wore when she'd already moved past the conversation in her mind and was waiting for him to catch up. The rifle's loaded, he said. I know how to load a rifle, Caleb. The second channel valve. I built the second channel valve. I know how it works. She drove the stake into the soil with 3 firm strikes of her palm. Go, he went. The trail to Tucson was 12 hours on a good day, and longer if the horse decided the heat was a reason to slow down, which this horse increasingly did. Caleb rode with the journal inside his coat, and the surveyor's sworn statement signed 3 days after his first visit by a man named Thomas Vetter, who'd written 4 careful pages documenting his 2 surveys of Red Basin Canyon and the complete absence of any twin-spired formation at its north terminus, folded inside the journal. He kept his hand on it periodically, not because he was worried about it falling out, but because the physical fact of it was reassuring in the way that solid evidence is reassuring when everything else is uncertain. He arrived in Tucson in the early evening and went directly to the boarding house on Meade Street, where he'd stayed the first time, a narrow building run by a woman named Clara Finch, who charged fare and didn't ask questions and made coffee in the morning that was strong enough to be worth waking up for. He found Merrick at the land office at 8 the next morning. Edwin Merrick was a small, neat man in his late 40s who wore the same style of coat every time Caleb had seen him and gave the impression of someone who had made precise decisions about his life and maintained them without effort. He was not warm, exactly. But he was scrupulous in the way that certain people who work with documents are scrupulous, committed to accuracy not from passion, but from the conviction that inaccuracy was a form of disorder he found personally offensive. He looked at the Vetter statement for a long time before he said anything. This is thorough, he said. Vetter is careful, he is. Merrick set the statement on the desk and aligned its edges with the edge of the blotter beneath it. Mr. Rourke, I need to tell you what I've found since you were last here, because it has bearing on how your challenge proceeds. He folded his hands on the desk. Samuel Oreth, who conducted the 1,879 survey for the Red Basin Land Company, also conducted surveys for 2 other land company claims in this territory between 1,877 and 1,882. Both of those claims were challenged. The company was settled quietly. The company paid the challenging party, and the documentation was withdrawn from public record. The other proceeded to territorial review and was found to contain reference point errors. Caleb sat very still. The same kind of errors, similar, not identical. Merrick picked up a folder from the side of his desk and opened it. The pattern in the second case was that Oreth used descriptions of formations that were either significantly different from what he described or in 2 instances not present at all. The territorial review concluded that the errors were consistent enough to suggest systematic misrepresentation rather than ordinary surveying mistakes. He fabricated them. Merrick looked at him over the folder. The review used the phrase systematic misrepresentation. I'll use the same language. He set the folder down. What this means for your challenge is that we now have 2 bodies of evidence. Your challenge based on the Vetter statement, the specific absence of the twin-spired formation, and the precedent from the earlier review, which establishes a pattern in Oreth's work that a territorial judge would be familiar with. He paused. Your challenge is considerably stronger than when you brought it to me the first time. Caleb exhaled slowly. How long for a ruling, he asked. Merrick's expression shifted in the way expressions shift when someone is deciding how honest to be. The company will respond to the formal challenge. They have 30 days. If they present counter-evidence, a second survey, a witness who claims the formation exists, the matter goes to a hearing. If they fail to present credible counter-evidence, the survey can be invalidated by administrative ruling without a full hearing. He looked at Caleb directly. If the company's lawyer is competent, he knows about the earlier review. He knows what Orith's history looks like. He may advise the company that the survey isn't worth defending. Or he may advise them to fight it anyway, because they have the money to tie it up. Yes, Merrick said, that's also a possibility. Caleb looked at his hands. They were calloused and cracked at the knuckles from the roof work and the channel extension, and there was a permanent line of red sandstone dust under his fingernails that no amount of washing had fully cleared since August. He looked like what he was, a man who had been doing hard physical work in a desert canyon for months, sitting across from a man in a neat coat in a government office, trying to use the law to protect something the law had never been designed with people like him in mind. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Everything you have. The filing, the journal, the Vetter statement. I'll attach them to the formal challenge documentation and submit to the Territorial Records Office before end of week." Merrick opened a desk drawer and produced a form. "I'll also need your signature on this. It authorizes the challenge in your name and attests that the documentation is accurate to your knowledge." Caleb read it. He read it slowly, which Merrick waited for without impatience, which Caleb noticed and appreciated. He signed it. "And now?" Caleb asked. "Now we wait for the company to respond." Merrick straightened the signed form and added it to the folder. "Go back to your homestead, Mr. Rourke. Keep documenting. Keep your occupation continuous. Don't let anyone convince you to leave voluntarily, because voluntary departure would complicate your claim in ways that the company's lawyers would absolutely exploit." He looked at him steadily. "And if anyone comes to your property making threats or attempting to interfere with your improvements, document that too, in writing with dates." Caleb rode back the next morning. He made the 12 hours in 11, which meant he pushed the horse harder than was kind, and the horse let him. And he came through the canyon crack in the early evening of the second day to find Eliza on the upper terrace, in the last of the light, on her knees in the soil, doing something he couldn't identify from where he stood. He called her name. She looked up. Something crossed her face when she saw him, not surprise, because she'd been listening for the wagon, but a particular release of tension that she didn't bother to hide. She got to her feet, brushing her hands on her dress. "Well," she called down. "Merrick filed it," he called back. "The challenge is in." She nodded once. Then she looked back down at what she'd been doing. "Come look at this," she said. He climbed the terrace steps. She was crouching again before he reached her, her hands in the soil, at the corner of the upper terrace where met the Kelches. She had pulled back the soil carefully from around something, and when he crouched beside her, he saw what it was. The third grape cutting. The one that had been hovering between alive and not since she'd planted it. She'd said nothing about the grapes to him. He'd noticed that. Noticed she never mentioned them. Assumed she was waiting for a reason to. Now he saw the reason. She'd peeled back the soil to expose the base of the cutting, and at the base, barely visible in the failing light, was the faint white thread of a new root. Not a strong root, not proof of anything definitive, but a root. "When?" he asked. "This morning." She covered it back up with careful hands, pressing the soil gently but firmly back into place, the way you'd settle a blanket over a sleeping child. "All three are going." He looked at her. "You never said anything about the grapes." "I didn't want to say anything until they'd decided to stay." She sat back on her heels and looked at the covered cutting. Plants are like that. You can do everything right, and they still don't always decide to stay. You just give them the best chance and wait. He thought about Merrick's office, about the signed form and the folder and the 30-day window, and the possibility that a competent lawyer on the other side might advise his client to fight it out regardless of the evidence. "People are like that too," he said. She looked at him. Yes. They sat there on the upper terrace in the last of the light, both of them tired and neither of them inclined to move yet. The formal notice from the Red Basin Land Company arrived 9 days later. It came with a man named Garrett Holloway, who was not Pike's nervous legal representative, but someone different, a compact, well-dressed man in his 30s with a flat, professional manner and eyes that moved over the canyon and everything in it, with the assessing efficiency of someone who has been paid to find weaknesses. He came through the crack with the composure of a man who was not going to let a sandstone passage affect his professional demeanor. Though Caleb noticed he'd scraped his left shoulder badly enough to leave a mark on his coat. Holloway handed Caleb the formal notice without preamble. It was 2 pages. Caleb read it, standing in the garden, while Holloway stood 3 feet away with his hands at his sides, and Eliza stood near the first terrace wall watching from a distance. The notice was politely worded and clearly stated that the Red Basin Land Company was formally asserting its water rights claim based on the 1879 Orith survey, that the Rourke homestead's improvements did not supersede the company's prior claim, and that the family would be required to vacate the premises or enter into a water access licensing arrangement within 60 days of the notice date. 60 days. Caleb looked up from the notice. "We've filed a challenge," he said, "with the Tucson Territorial Office. It's on record." Holloway's expression didn't change. "I'm aware of the challenge. The company will respond within its 30-day window as required. The Orith survey has documentation problems." The 6th reference point. The company's position on the survey documentation will be addressed in its formal response. He said it clean heat, the way people say things when they've been trained to say them without giving anything away. "I'm here to deliver the notice. I've delivered it. Do you have questions about the notice itself?" "No." "Then I'll be leaving." He looked around the canyon once more, the same measuring scan Slade had used, but faster and more professional. Then he went back through the crack. Caleb stood holding the notice. Eliza walked over from the terrace wall and read it over his shoulder. He felt her stillness as she read, not the stillness of shock. Eliza didn't shock easily, but the particular stillness of someone absorbing information they need to act on. 60 days, she said. "We have the challenge on record." Merrick said, "I know what Merrick said." She took the notice from him and read it again, slower. "The company's response is due in 30 days. If they don't produce counter-evidence, the survey can be invalidated by administrative ruling. But if they do produce something, another survey, a witness, then it goes to a hearing." "How long is a hearing?" "Merrick didn't give me a number." She folded the notice. "Longer than 60 days, probably." He said nothing, because she was right, and they both knew it, and there was no useful addition he could make to that. "So if they produce counter-evidence," she said, "and it goes to a hearing, and the hearing is scheduled past the 60-day window, they'll claim we're in violation of the notice while the hearing is pending." She looked at him. "They can use that. Their lawyer can try to use that." "Caleb." Her voice was not sharp, but it was exact. "A lawyer like that man who just left here can use almost anything. That's what he's paid to do." She looked at the notice in her hand. "We need Merrick to move faster than 30 days. Merrick said 30 days is the law. Then we need the company's response to be obviously inadequate, so the administrative ruling happens before the 60 days is up." She was thinking out loud now, not really talking to him so much as working through it in the only way that worked for her, saying it to see if it held. If Orith's pattern is as bad as Merrick said, and if the company knows their lawyer knows it, they might not file a counter-survey at all. They might file a legal argument instead, a procedural challenge to our filing, or an argument about the priority of the dates. She looked at him. A legal argument without factual evidence can be ruled on faster than a full counter-survey. Caleb stared at her. "How do you know that?" She blinked. "I don't specifically, but it's how most arguments work. If you can't challenge the facts, you challenge the process." She folded the notice again and put it in her apron pocket. "I need to write to Merrick. Tonight." He watched her walk toward the cabin. Then he looked at the canyon. At the garden they'd spent the better part of a year building. At the terraces. At the seep still running in the afternoon quiet. At the cottonwood that had grown visibly since August, its leaves turned yellow now in the fall. 60 days. He looked at the turnips still in the ground, the ones Eliza had decided not to pull yet, because she wanted them to size up further. He looked at the squash stacked against the cabin wall. He looked at Tobin, who had appeared from somewhere. The boy had a talent for materializing during adult crises, as if he sensed them from wherever he was and came to observe, and was sitting on the first terrace wall watching his father with the serious, patient expression of a child who understands that something important is happening and has decided that staying quiet is the most useful thing he can do. You okay? Caleb asked him. Are we leaving? Tobin asked. No. Tobin nodded once, accepting this, and looked at the canyon the same way Caleb was looking at it, like he was measuring something, taking inventory of what was there. Good, the boy said. I don't want to leave. Neither do I. Eliza wrote to Merrick that evening by firelight, 6 pages in her small, precise handwriting, laying out the 60-day timeline and the likely strategy a competent company lawyer would use to exploit the gap between the hearing schedule and the notice window. She wrote it clearly, without legal language, as a plain description of the problem she was asking him to address. She didn't ask him to bend the rules. She asked him to understand the timeline and to move within whatever latitude the rules gave him. She sealed it. Caleb rode it to the nearest way station the following morning, paid the rider extra to make Tucson before any other deliveries, and came back by afternoon. Then they waited. Waiting was its own kind of work. It had a texture and a weight to it that the physical work didn't have. The physical work was hard in a way you could exhaust, where you reached the end of your energy and you put the tools down and you slept. Waiting didn't exhaust. It just sat in the body at a low continuous level and wore at things from the inside. Eliza dealt with it by working. She expanded the west wall terrace as she'd been planning, bringing in 2 more hauling trips of wash soil in the cold November days, working in the mornings when the light was good and her body was warmest and the wrapped hand mostly healed now. The smallest finger, still slightly thick, but functional, didn't pull at her too badly. She worked through the first frost, covering the surviving plants the night before, with canvas she'd sewn from old wagon, covering, tying it down at the corners against the wind, checking it before dawn to make sure it had held. She lost the lettuce. It had been on borrowed time anyway. She'd known it, but she still stood over it the morning after the frost and looked at the blackened leaves for a moment before she cleared it. She saved everything else. Caleb worked on the root cellar expansion, making it larger, deeper, properly sealed with clay and flat stone, a real storage space rather than the alcove they'd been managing with. He carved it out over 3 weeks of methodical work in the base of the canyon wall, the dust filling in his lungs and settling in his hair and coating the back of his throat, his arms aching by evening, his hands finding new ways to be cut by sandstone every day. But when it was finished, rough-walled, low-ceilinged, smelling of cold stone and dry earth, it was real. It was the kind of space that said permanence in a language even a land lawyer could understand. He added it to the journal with measurements and a date. Merrick's response came 3 weeks after Eliza's letter. It came in an official envelope, sealed with the land office stamp, carried by a rider who handed it over at the canyon entrance without ceremony. Caleb brought it inside. He and Eliza sat at the table, and Caleb opened it. Merrick had written 2 pages. His handwriting was, predictably, extremely neat. He had reviewed the timeline. He agreed that a 60-day notice window and a 30-day company response window created the overlap Eliza had identified. He had consulted the Territorial Review Code. Under the code, if the company's formal response to the challenge consisted entirely of legal argument without factual counter-evidence, no second survey, no materials witness testimony, he had authority to issue a preliminary administrative finding within 15 days of receiving that response. A preliminary finding was not a final ruling, but it would establish the Rourke challenge as legally active, and the survey as formally under question. Most of its windows were dark, which would be sufficient to prevent the company from using the notice window offensively in court while the finding was pending. He had also included, at the bottom of the second page, a single additional sentence. I have reviewed the Orth survey's other documented claims and find the pattern of reference point description consistent with that identified in the 1883 Territorial Review. I have so noted in the file. Caleb read that last sentence 3 times. He's put it in writing, he said. Eliza read it. She set the letter down on the table. She was very still for a moment. He's put it in the official file, she said. Not just in a letter to us. In the territorial record. Yes, she looked at the letter. Caleb looked at her looking at it. He'd learned over the course of their marriage that Eliza processed good news more slowly than bad news she dealt with fast, almost instantly, because she'd spent her whole life in a ready posture for bad news. Good news required a longer adjustment. She turned it over and checked it from different angles the way she checked stones before she placed them in the terrace wall, making sure it held. The company's lawyer will see Merrick's notation, she said. Yes, and he'll advise his client accordingly. Probably. She picked up the letter and read it again. This isn't over, she said. No? But it's different now than it was yesterday. She set the letter down. She looked at him across the table. Her hands were folded in front of her, and her expression was the one he recognized from the morning. She'd opened the tin seed box on the terrace, careful and committed, and not willing to let hope get ahead of what the evidence actually supported. It's different, he agreed. What happened next came faster than either of them had prepared for. The company's formal response arrived at the Tucson Territorial Office 22 days after the challenge was filed. Merrick sent word through the same writer network within 48 hours of receiving it. The word was brief. The company had filed a legal argument challenging the procedural validity of the Rourke homestead, filing on the grounds that the initial documentation had been submitted without notarization. No second survey, no material witness, no factual counter-evidence, no twin spires. Merrick issued his preliminary administrative finding 11 days later. The Orith Survey's sixth reference point was formally noted as unverified and inconsistent with documented territorial geography. The Rourke Homestead Challenge was established as legally active. The water rights claim of the Red Basin's Land Company was placed under formal review, suspended pending resolution, and the 60-day notice was stayed. The company could not act on the notice while the review was pending. They were still in the canyon. Caleb was splitting firewood at the east wall when Eliza came out of the cabin with the rider's message in her hand. He could tell from the way she walked, not running. Eliza didn't run toward things. She moved toward them with the deliberate pace of someone who has trained themselves not to get ahead of reality. But something in her stride was different. She handed him the message. He read it standing with the axe still in his hand. He put the axe down. He looked at the canyon, the terraces, the channels, the root cellar door he'd hung last week, the surviving plants under canvas, waiting for the winter to move through, the cottonwood yellow against the red walls. We're still here, he said. It came out quiet and flat, not dramatic, just true. We're still here, Eliza said. Tobin appeared from the root cellar where he'd been doing the inventory. Eliza had asked him to do counting the stored turnips and squash by size and condition, which he'd been taking extremely seriously for 3 days. He came out blinking in the light, saw his parents standing together in the middle of the canyon floor not working, which was unusual, and looked between them. What happened, he asked. Caleb looked at Eliza. She looked at Caleb. There was a conversation in that exchange that had nothing to do with words, the particular private language of two people who have spent enough years together to have a fluency in each other's silences. We're not leaving, Caleb told him. Tobin absorbed this. I know, he said, and went back into the root cellar to finish his count. But the staying wasn't finished. Merrick's preliminary findings suspended the immediate threat, but preliminary was not final, and the company still had options. A formal hearing was now on the territorial calendar, not imminent, but scheduled. The Rourkes would need to appear. They would need to present their evidence in front of a territorial judge, who would weigh it against whatever argument the company's lawyer had prepared. And that argument, even without factual counter-evidence, could be thorough, and it could be expensive to counter, and it would be conducted in a room where Caleb and Eliza Rourke were not the kind of people who were usually expected to win. Merrick's writer had included a note about the hearing date at the bottom of his message. February, 3 months away. Eliza read the hearing date and then looked up at the canyon walls. 3 months. She looked at the grape cuttings. All 3 alive now. The strongest one had 7 leaves and the beginning of what would eventually become a proper vine, its first tendrils beginning to reach toward the warm sandstone of the south-facing wall. They needed another season to establish. Maybe 2 before they'd produce anything worth harvesting. She'd known that when she planted them. She was going to be here for those seasons. She was going to stand at the base of that wall and watch those vines climb the sandstone she'd worn with her own body on cold mornings, pressing her palms against it to accelerate the heat. She was going to harvest grapes in cans in this canyon and press them in whatever way she could figure out with the tools she had, and she was going to drink whatever came of it with Caleb and let Tobin have a small amount that she'd pretend she wasn't giving him, and nobody was going to take that from her. Not Slade with his patient smile, Not Holloway with his neat coat and his official notice. Not the Red Basin Land Company with its paper claims and its dead surveyors' fabricated formations. She put the writer's message in her apron pocket and picked up the trowel she'd set down when the writer arrived. The West Terrace still needed 3 more stones placed before the day's light was gone. She went to place them. The 3 months between Merrick's preliminary finding and the February hearing the strangest of all the time the Rourkes had spent in the canyon. Strange because the immediate danger had moved back far enough that they could breathe, but not so far that they could forget it was there. Strange because the work continued, it always continued, but now it had a dual purpose that hadn't existed before. Every improvement they made was simultaneously a thing they needed for survival and a piece of evidence for a hearing room in Tucson. Caleb added to the journal almost daily. Dates and measurements and descriptions written in his Plainsville, Missouri hand, Eliza's precise additions in the margins, the record of a life being lived in a place and documented as it was being lived, which is a peculiar thing to be conscious of while you're doing it. December came into the canyon hard. The desert doesn't do winter the way people from the east imagine it, not snow and silence and the soft muffling of the world under white. It does cold that arrives with wind and stays mean. The kind of cold that has nothing insulating about it, that finds every gap in a stone wall and every thin place in a canvas cover and makes itself at home there. The seeps slowed in December. Not stopped, they never stopped, which was the thing about seeps. They came from too deep and too far back to be fully affected by surface temperature, but they ran thinner, the water moving down the rock face in lines so narrow you had to watch closely to confirm they were still moving. Eliza watched closely. Every morning, first thing, before the fire, before coffee, before anything. She went to each seep and put her hand against the stone and confirmed the moisture and went back inside. Caleb watched her do it and understood, without asking, that this was not a ritual she was willing to have interrupted or questioned. The seeps were the foundation. As long as the seeps ran, everything else was arguable. The garden was mostly dormant now. The garden was their work through 2 hard frosts, but by mid-December she'd made the call to pull what remained and bring it inside. Turnips into the root cellar, stacked carefully by size. The last of the squash. Dried beans in cloth bags hung from the cabin ceiling. Onions braided and hung beside them. The grape cuttings stayed in the ground. She'd built a small stone windbreak around them in November. 3 sides of flat sandstone stacked knee-high, open on the south face to let the thin winter sun reach them. She packed dry grass around the base of each cutting and covered it with a flat stone, weighted down against the wind. It was not a sophisticated protective structure. She'd built it from what she had, which was sandstone and dry grass and the particular kind of determination that stops asking whether something is possible and just does it. All 3 cuttings went into winter alive. The waiting during those 3 months did something to each of them differently. It made Caleb quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. He had always been a man who thought in long stretches, who let ideas sit and turn over before he acted on them. But this was something else. He'd lie awake some nights, and she could feel it across the narrow distance of the cabin, the quality of wakefulness that isn't rest. He was running the hearing in his mind. She knew because she was doing it too, going through what Merrick had filed, going through what Holloway might argue, going through the moment when they would stand in a room in Tucson and make the case for everything they'd built, in front of a man who didn't know them and had no particular reason to rule in their favor. She didn't raise it at night. There was nothing useful to say about it in the dark. And useful was the standard she held most things to. Tobin, who was nearly 6 now, and had the particular awareness of a child raised among adults who were managing serious things, had developed a habit of asking very precise questions at unexpected moments. One morning in January, while Caleb was repairing the channel wall and Eliza was repointing the cabin's north corner where the clay had cracked in the cold, Tobin came and stood beside her and said, "Are the men in Tucson going to let us stay?" She kept her hands moving on the clay. "We're going to Tucson to make sure they do. What if they don't?" She looked at him. He was looking at the canyon, at the walls, the terraces, the covered grape cuttings, the root cellar door, the cottonwood standing bare and gray against the red stone. He was taking inventory, she realized, the same way she did, the same instinct already. "Then we find another way," she said. "What other way?" "I don't know yet." But there's always another way. She pressed clay into the wall, crack with her thumb, and worked it smooth. The question is whether you're willing to look for it when you're tired and scared, and it would be easier to quit. He thought about this. Are you tired and scared? Some. Are you going to quit? She looked at the wall she was repairing, at the canyon around it, at 22 pages of dated journal entries and 3 grape cuttings wrapped in dry grass against the cold. No, she said. He went back to whatever he'd been doing, satisfied the way children are satisfied when they've confirmed the thing they needed to confirm. They left for Tucson on a Wednesday in the first week of February. It was the first time all 3 of them had left the canyon together since they'd arrived. The thought of leaving it empty sat uneasily with Eliza. She said nothing about it, because there was nothing practical to be said. They had no one to leave it with, and no alternative to going. But she looked back through the crack as she came through last, and stood on the outside of the canyon wall for a moment, listening. The seeps, faint on the other side of the stone. Still running, she turned and got in the wagon. The territorial courthouse in Tucson was a low adobe building on a side street that smelled of pipe smoke and old paper, and the particular staleness of a room where serious decisions had been made for long. Enough that the seriousness had soaked into the walls. The hearing was in a room with 4 benches, a judge's table, and 3 windows that looked out onto nothing interesting. There were perhaps a dozen people present when the Rourkes arrived. Merrick, sitting at one side with his folder, Holloway, the company's lawyer, at the other side with a considerably larger folder. Its windows were dark. Caleb didn't recognize who had the look of being there in support of the company's position, and a handful of observers who appeared to have no stake in the matter beyond the interest of having somewhere to be on a cold February morning. The judge was a man named Aldous Crane. He was older than Caleb had expected, somewhere past 60, with a face that had settled into the particular neutrality of someone who's heard too many arguments for any of them to produce a strong reaction anymore. He wore reading spectacles and kept them pushed up on his forehead until he needed them, at which point he pulled them down with one finger in a proactive motion that he clearly did 20 times a day without noticing. He looked at the Rourkes when they entered, looked at Caleb, at Eliza, at Tobin. They'd had no one to leave the boy with, and he'd been told to sit still, which he was doing on the end bench, with the rigid discipline of a child who understands the stakes. Crane pulled his spectacles down and looked at the documents Merrick had placed on his table. This is the Rourke Homestead challenge to the Red Basin Land Company water rights claim, he said. Not a question. A confirmation of what he'd already read. He set the spectacles back up. Mr. Holloway. Holloway stood. He was composed and professional, and he presented the company's argument for 32 minutes, without a note, which meant he'd memorized it, which meant he'd been preparing for this considerably longer than 30 days. His argument was procedural. The Rourke filing had not been properly notarized at submission, which he argued invited a question about its legal validity. He did not address the survey question directly. He spent 4 minutes on the notarization issue, and the remaining 28 minutes on the legal history of water rights precedent in territorial land claims, which was thorough and which was also, Caleb noticed, almost entirely not about this specific situation. When Holloway sat down, Crane looked at Merrick. Merrick stood. He was not a dramatic man, and he did not present dramatically. He explained in plain language that the notarization requirement Holloway cited had been revised by Territorial Code Amendment in 1885, 3 years before the Rourke filing. The original filing requirement had been waived for homestead claims under a specific acreage threshold, which the Rourke claim met. He provided the code citation. He had brought 2 copies, one of which he handed to Holloway without expression. Holloway looked at the code citation. Something shifted in his face very slightly and then was controlled. Merrick then addressed the survey. He presented the Vetter statement. He presented the notation he had added to the territorial file regarding Orith's pattern of misrepresentation in other surveys. He presented a copy of the 1,883 territorial review findings on Orith's previous claim work. He laid these things on Crane's table in a neat stack in the order he'd described them, and then he sat down. Crane pulled his spectacles down and read. He read for a long time. The room was quiet except for the occasional shift of someone on a bench and a wind that had picked up outside and was pushing at the windows. Caleb sat with his hands on his knees. He was looking at the table. Eliza was looking at Crane. She watched the judge's eyes move across the Vetter statement, stop, move back, read a section again. She watched if its windows were dark. She watched him pick up the 1883 review and compare something on the first page to something on the Vetter statement. She watched his expression, which gave almost nothing away, and tried to read whatever the almost was. Tobin sat at the end of the bench and did not move. Crane set the documents down. He pulled his spectacles up. He looked at Holloway. Counsel, he said, your notarization argument fails on the code amendment. You know this. He said it without heat. What else do you have? Holloway stood. Your Honor, the company's position is that the Orith survey, as a prior filed document, the Orith survey's 6th reference point is unverified by 2 independent surveyors and is consistent with a pattern of misrepresentation in the surveyor's prior work, as documented in this office's own 1883 review. Crane's voice hadn't changed in temperature. What material evidence does the company offer in support of the 6th reference point's existence? A pause that was exactly 1 beat too long. At this time, Holloway said, the company relies on the survey documentation itself. The survey documentation itself describes a formation that your opposing party's surveyor attests does not exist, and that the 1883 review establishes a pattern of doubt around. Crane looked at him steadily. That's circular, Mr. Holloway. The document can't verify itself. Holloway said nothing. There was nothing to say. Crane looked at his documents for another moment. Then he looked at Caleb. Mr. Rourke, he said, this journal. He held up the expedition journal. Eliza's tin box had held it safe through everything, and they'd brought it here in the same box it had lived in since Kansas, the box now battered and scratched and still closing firmly. You maintained this yourself? Yes, sir. My wife contributed to it as well. The entries are dated consecutively from August 1888 through last week. Yes, sir. And the improvements it documents, the basins, channels, terraces, structures, these are present on the homestead as described. They are. Merrick's office has our full filing documentation, and I've read the documentation. Crane set the journal down. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stack of papers in front of him. Then he looked up, not at either of the lawyers, but directly at the Rourkes, at Caleb, at Eliza, and then briefly at Tobin on the end bench, who was sitting so still he might have been a painting of a boy rather than an actual one. Whatever Crane saw, he looked at it for 3 full seconds. Then he pulled his spectacles down and began to write. He wrote for 8 minutes. Nobody spoke. The wind pushed at the windows. Eliza was conscious of her own heartbeat in a way she usually wasn't. The way you become aware of it when the body has decided that what is happening right now is important enough to monitor closely. Crane set his pen down. The Red Basin Land Company's water rights claim, he said, is based on a survey containing a material reference point that cannot be verified and is consistent with documented misrepresentation in the surveyor's prior work. The company has offered no independent evidence to support the reference point's existence. The Rourke Homestead Challenge is therefore sustained. The Orith survey claim to the seep system in question is hereby invalidated. He pulled his spectacles up. The Rourke Homestead filing stands. The water rights claim is dismissed. Continuous occupation with documented improvements constitutes sufficient basis for the homestead's legal standing. He looked at Holloway. The company's 60-day notice is void. Any further action against the Rourke homestead on the basis of the Orith survey will be considered in violation of this ruling. He closed his folder. That's all, he said. Eliza heard Caleb exhale beside her. It was a long, slow exhale, the kind that carries something heavy out with it that has been sitting in the chest for months. She felt it in her own chest not release. Not yet. Her body was still running the tight-focused energy of the hearing room, and it would take time to recognize that the thing it had been bracing against was no longer coming. But she felt the shift. She looked at Holloway. He was already gathering his papers with the efficient, effect-free movements of a professional who has lost before and will lose again, and does not personalize it. He didn't look at the Rourkes. She looked at Merrick, who was closing his own folder with the measured satisfaction of a precise man whose precision had just been vindicated. He caught her eye. He gave one small, deliberate nod. She looked at Caleb. He was looking at his hands in the way he did when he was feeling something significant and needed to look at something other than the thing he was feeling. She put her hand over his, the same hand she'd put over his on the terrace wall in November, when he'd come back from Tucson with the Vetter statement, and she felt the tension in it, the months of it, everything that had been held in that hand, and she pressed down once, firmly, and then let go. Tobin had been watching them from the end of the bench. When the room began to move, people standing, papers being gathered, the quiet, organized departure of people whose business is finished, he walked to where his parents were standing and looked up at them. "Can we go home?" he asked. Caleb looked at Eliza. "Yes," she said. "We can go home." They drove back to the canyon in 3 days, and the canyon was exactly as they'd left it. That was both obvious and not obvious, because no one had come and done anything to it in the 4 days they'd been gone. Not obvious because there had been a version of the world, possible until Crane had set his pen down, where coming back would have meant coming back to something already lost. The fact that it was simply there, the crack in the wall, the passage, the seep still running thin but steady in the February cold, had a quality that wasn't quite the same as it had been before they left. Eliza went straight to the grape cuttings. She crouched in the cold and removed the flat stones and the dry grass covering, carefully, and looked at each cutting. All 3 had held through the winter. The strongest one had a new bud, at the base of the stem tight and pale green, and impossibly small, but unmistakably a bud, formed while they were in Tucson, while Crane was writing his ruling, while they were driving back across the desert. The vine had been doing its own work, entirely indifferent to the legal situation, putting down roots and building structure in the cold soil of the canyon that it had decided, in the way plants decide things, was where it belonged. She covered it back up with the dry grass, left the flat stones off the temperature, had lifted enough that she thought she could risk the direct air, and the bud needed to know which direction up was. She stood up. She looked at the canyon. This was the part she hadn't let herself think about during the hearing, during the waiting, during all the months of documentation and legal argument, and watching men in good coats walk through the crack and measure things with their eyes. She hadn't let herself think about what it would feel like if it was actually over. It was a habit she'd developed through 2 failed farms, and too many other things, the habit of not looking at the good outcome because looking at it made losing it worse. She'd kept her eyes on the problem, on what needed to be done, on the next step and the step after that, and she hadn't looked up. Now she looked up. The canyon walls rose red and solid on all 4 sides. The seeps ran. The cottonwood stood at the north wall, bare in February, but with the swollen look of buds not far from opening. The terraces she'd built stepped up the north face in the rough, imperfect geometry of work done by someone who didn't know how to do it and did it anyway and figured it out as they went. The channels ran in the lines she'd cut into the stone with a sharpened stake over 3 weeks in the Arizona heat of the previous summer. The cabin sat against the east wall with its too low door frame that Caleb hit his head on, and the window that let in too much wind, and the roof seam that had leaked twice and been repaired twice and would probably need a 3rd repair before the spring rains. None of it was pretty. None of it was what it would have been if they'd had money or time or more than they'd had. All of it was real. Spring came to the canyon the way spring comes to desert country tentatively at first, as if testing whether the cold was really finished, and then with an abruptness that surprised even Eliza, who'd been watching for it. The cottonwood leafed out in March, seemingly overnight, going from bare gray branches to green so fast that Tobin swore it had changed while he was sleeping. The terraces, dormant through winter, began to show the faint green signals of returning life in the places where she'd let volunteer plants run to seed the previous fall. She started seeds in the cabin in late February in small clay pots on the window ledge that got the afternoon light. Beans, squash, lettuce, onions, turnips. More this year than last, because the west terrace was finished now and the expanded channel system could support it. And because the root cellar had proven itself through winter, and she knew she could store what she grew. Caleb built the peach and apple trees into the plan. He'd trade its windows were dark. He'd traded for 2 saplings at a way station on the return from Tucson, young enough to transport, old enough to have a chance, and he planted them beside the cottonwood in March, staking them against the wind with strips of cloth tied loose enough not to cut the bark. They looked inadequate in the canyon, those two small trees planted with the stubborn optimism of a man who had decided he was going to be somewhere long enough to eat the fruit. Tobin planted his own seeds. He'd asked Eliza in February if he could have a section of the terrace. She'd said yes, and shown him the corner of the second terrace, the section nearest the cabin steps that got good sun and was closest to the water channel. He'd chosen what to plant himself beans because he'd helped carry them through the crack the previous summer and felt proprietary about them, and he'd laid them out in rows with a seriousness that made Caleb look away to hide his expression. Eliza watched her son plant his beans and thought about her own mother in Ohio, a woman she hadn't seen in 12 years, who had pressed the first seeds into her daughter's hands at a kitchen table the morning she left for her marriage and said only, "Don't let anything kill them." She hadn't. Through Kansas and Texas and New Mexico, and 11 days of brutal trail, and a crack in a sandstone wall, and a land company with lawyers, and a winter that had tested every covered plant in the garden. She hadn't let anything kill them. Summer came in hard. The way Arizona summer comes in not gradually, but all at once. The temperature jumping 2 weeks in May and staying there. The bean plants climbed. Tobin's corner of the second terrace was, by June, a visible, productive section of the garden by any measure, and he checked it every morning with an ownership that nobody questioned. The squash spread across the upper terrace. The onions thickened below. The turnips swelled in the deep soil at the base of the north wall. Caleb extended the irrigation network to the west terrace that first full summer, carving new channels in the evenings after the worst heat had passed, connecting the new beds to the seep system. It was slower work than the original channels had been because he was better at it now, and better meant more careful, and careful meant slower. Eliza's finger had fully healed by spring. She could feel where the smallest bone had been cracked a slight irregularity when she pressed it that hadn't been there before, but it didn't pull or limit her, and she mostly forgot about it except when the cold was particularly sharp, and it ached in a way that reminded her of the day it happened, the stone moving wrong, the 10 minutes, sitting on the ground, deciding not to cry. She didn't have a problem with being reminded. Everything in this canyon had cost something. She'd rather carry the cost in her body than forget she'd paid it. The grapevines were the measure of the year. The strongest vine climbed 14 inches up the warm sands and stone of the south-facing wall by August. 14 inches of actual vine, with actual leaves, 7 of them, each one a distinct flat green against the red rock, and at the base of the fourth leaf node, the small, tight cluster of what would eventually, in another season or two, be a grape. Not a grape yet. The beginning of the structure that would hold a grape. But Eliza saw it on a Tuesday morning in August and stopped completely and crouched beside it and looked at it for a long time without touching it. She thought about the damp cloth she'd rewrapped, 3 times crossing the territory. The morning she'd pressed the cuttings into the soil in a silence she hadn't been able to explain to herself. The frost she'd covered them through, the cold she'd built the stone windbreak against, the morning she'd removed the flat stones and seen the bud forming while they were in Tucson. The vine had been doing its own work, the whole time, underneath everything. Eliza. She looked up. Caleb was standing at the base of the terrace steps, watching her crouch by the vine. "Come look," she said. He came up the steps and crouched beside her, and she pointed at the small node cluster. He looked at it for a moment. "Is that he started?" Yes, he was quiet. 2 more seasons, she said. Maybe 3. "You'll have grapes in this canyon," he said. He said it simply, without making it more than it was, and that was why she loved Hinson, the way he could say a plain sentence that held everything in it, without reaching for a larger word. "We'll have grapes," she said. September arrived, and the harvest came the way it comes on a working garden, not in a single triumphant moment, but in the ongoing, demanding, physically exhausting series of pulls and cuts and carries and sorting decisions that make up the actual experience of growing food. It was not romantic work. It was hard on the back and the knees and the hands, and the Arizona September heat made it harder, and Eliza moved through it with the methodical pace of someone who has learned that the only way through a large piece of work is to take the next piece, and then the piece after that, until you look up and it's done. They harvested more than they ate. Not dramatically more, the garden was still small relative to what it could eventually be, and they ate well, but not extravagantly, and the root cellar filled to a level that Eliza considered adequate rather than abundant. But more. Enough more to store through winter comfortably. Enough to have given twice to travelers who'd come through the crack in the late summer heat and whose need was evident. The day Eliza considered the fullest was an afternoon in the third week of September when the light came down into the canyon at the particular angle that made the red walls almost glow. She was on the upper terrace, pulling the last of the squash from the vine, setting each one carefully in the baskets beside her. Windows were dark. Caleb was working below, carrying the bean harvest from Tobin's corner of the second terrace, calling up something to the boy that she couldn't fully hear, and Tobin was laughing at whatever it was, his small voice carrying up the canyon wall and bouncing off the stone in the way sounds do in enclosed spaces. She stopped pulling squash. She looked at her hands. Broad and calloused and permanently stained with the particular reddish dust of the canyon soil, the nails broken at uneven lengths, the smallest finger on the left hand slightly thickened at the old fracture point. They were not hands she would have recognized 12 years ago in Ohio. She looked at the terrace she was standing on, at the wall she'd built imperfect, rough, one section that leaned 3 degrees more than it should and had been refusing to be corrected for 6 months, but holding all the soil behind it and directing the water across it and doing the job it had been built to do. At the channels running below, at the seeps beyond, still moving the same way they'd been moving when the first Spanish explorers crossed this country 3 centuries earlier, long before any survey or any land company or any document filed in any office by any man. At the grapevines on the south wall, 14 inches of vine plus the 8 more inches it had grown since August, growing toward the warmth of the canyon, as if it had decided the canyon was where it had always been going. She picked up her basket. It was heavy. The squash she'd harvested were good-sized, better than last year, which had been better than the year before the farm she'd spent in New Mexico that the drought had taken. She settled the basket against her hip and stood at the top of the terrace and breathed the canyon air. Below her, Caleb had straightened up from the bean rows and was looking at her. He had squash under one arm and a bundle of dried bean plants over his shoulder, and he looked exactly like what he was, a man in his late 30s who had been doing hard physical work in a desert canyon for over a year, tired and weathered and not elegant about it. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and there was no word exchanged because there was nothing to say that the looking didn't already say. Tobin came up the terrace steps with his small basket. He'd harvested his beans himself, everyone, and the basket held them in the careful arrangement of someone who had been thinking about the presentation. He looked around the canyon, not the way adults look at things, measuring, calculating, worrying, but the direct, clear-eyed look of a child who has not yet learned to qualify what he sees. "We did this," he said. He didn't say it to either of them specifically. He said it to the canyon, to the walls and the terraces and the vines and the seeps and the cottonwood that had grown 2 feet since August and would outlast all of them. Eliza looked at her son. "Yes," she said. "We did." She meant all of it. The basins and the channels and the 22 pages of journal and the ride to Tucson and the hearing and the moment Crane set his pen down and the 3 grape cuttings in the cold and the stone windbreak and the flat stones she'd removed to let the bud find the light and every hauling trip through the crack with a bucket in her hands and her body pressed between 2 walls of sandstone that didn't care about her situation, just whether she fit or didn't. She meant the 2 farms they'd lost, the drought in Texas and the hail in New Mexico, and the 11 days of brutal trail, and the morning they'd stood at a crack in a canyon wall and decided to go through it. She meant Tobin's beans, arranged carefully in a small basket by a boy who took his work seriously. She meant all of it. The canyon held them in its red walls as the September light moved across it, slow and amber, touching the terraces and the vine leaves and the surface of the basin water and the stone walls of the cabin, and Eliza's broad shoulders and Caleb's tired hands and Tobin's small serious face, and then moving past, the way light moves, not stopping, not staying, just touching things as it went and leaving them changed by the contact. The seeps ran. They had always run. They would run long past this family, past any family, past the documents and the surveys and the courts, and the neat coats of the men who had tried to take what was not theirs to take. The water came from somewhere high above and behind, working through the rock for years before it found the surface, patient and indifferent and absolutely committed to its own direction. Eliza had understood that the first time she'd pressed her palm against the wet stone. Some things move toward where they're going, regardless of everything that tries to stop them. You don't conquer that kind of terrain. You find the crack in the wall and you go through it, and you figure out what it needs, and give it what you have, and you stay. That was all. That was everything. The desert beyond the canyon walls was still exactly what it had always been, indifferent and merciless, and entirely without concern for the ambitions of the people who crossed it. But inside the hidden canyon, in the space between the red walls, where water ran from stone, and grapevines climbed in toward warmth, and a boy carried his harvest in careful hands, and a woman stood at the top of a terrace she'd built from nothing with the weight of good food on her. Something had been made that the desert had not given them, and could not take away. They had made it themselves, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was home.